I'm speaking to you as Michael D. Higgins, I assure you. And that's why I don't restrain my views on some of these matters. I think that what has been unleashed in the world, it is a good question as to whether we're recoverable. That's why I try to find aspects of hope myself.
Uachtarán, a he, if I can call it, isn't that the word see? You know, I've been wanting to have this conversation so long with you about Untanga Gaeilge. And I even don't know where to begin. I suppose the first thing is, like, what does the Irish language mean for you? And we've Gaeilge on Gheimhridh, you know that lovely expression, Gaeilge on Gheimhridh. Irish, well, and of course, I'll say Irish words and you'll understand, but maybe the people at home won't. So, Beidige Derma Rudi Asper.
Yeah.
So, from the cradle.
Gheimhridh just went all on montadans intagam William Clun agus to pieces screecham fuinchen. I must say I was very fortunate very early on in the primary teacher that I had. And I did not have Irish from the beginning. I was 5 when I went to live with my aunt and uncle, and they didn't speak Irish to me, but I went to the primary school actually rather late at the age of 7, I think, and the teacher was a very extraordinary teacher. He was William Clun. So it was William Clun's practice that in the good weather we would go out and the names of plants and the names of different hills and pieces of history. He would the plants he would know in Latin and Irish and English. And it was very unusual is that he had a belief himself that because it had been the language of your ancestors, that if you concentrated long enough, any word would come to you. So that was my first encounter with the Irish language. And then some dara level, at second level, I would have studied all of the subjects through Irish in Cloister Flannan and St. Flannan's College. That's when I first perhaps saw the difference between an Gaeilge Laura and agus Cursi Astrucán, because I think the difference between the spoken Irish, that is what I missed, I think. The Irish as it was in fact spoken every day by people. I do regret that in relation to the language as I hear it, I would have liked to been able to access older forms of the language and older descriptions, but kind of the Mohawkine.
Yeah. Doesn't that bring us back to what your first teacher said, Clun, that because it's an ancestral language, what if we listen long enough, we should feel it inside us? What a concept for you to have been made aware of, being introduced to at such a young age.
I remember people being interested in the language as a set of sounds. I was at Indiana University I think the anthropology department were interested in say something in Ireland. I told them I was very inadequate because I was not a native speaker, but I would be able to tell them what the words were or how they sounded, and I would have done that. So then when I came back and became involved in politics, it was very important to me. And I started all over again on the Gaeilge Laura. And the difficulty I had with the spoken Irish was the language of grammar and of syntax was Munster Irish. I could cause awful difficulty for you by saying I believe myself that the language of Húigínn is probably the best language.
Beautiful.
But that will cause controversy for you. But probably Carataig too, maybe. But why? Because for me, the use of all the sounds, na fum and iliok, that was attractive to me. So then, because Radio na Gaeilge was coming into existence, and then of course I would be involved in teaching car, and because people would ring me because to make a note very early in the morning at 8 o'clock, it was important for me, and it just take me a few minutes listening to Gaeilge Ola, to the Ulster Irish, before my ear would become sensitized, and so I would say I was satisfied that I was speaking Irish better after my long relationship with Connemara Irish, but I probably found it more difficult to write in Irish. Now, I didn't say, of course, that my first appointment in the university was actually as an assistant to Lima Buchler and in economics. So I taught economics through Irish, using his different books, Bonus and Gaeilge and Cudas, Siachtas, Bonus na Troctora, things like that, but these kind of things. But I would have to give a lecture on Keynes in Irish. And it was interesting, the relationship I had with him. He was the Cathaoirleach of the Seanad. Now, I always remember on the day I enrolled in the college, I filled in the form in English, I think, and he said, Foras cúnd an clárachas ní líne sin form in Gaeilge, you know. Oh, he was one of the kind of authoritarian, but he was commissioned. He dedicated all those 3 books, to him and De Valera, the chancellor of the university, and so he would be stuck in the Senate maybe late, and I would get a note passed through the door. My landlady would say that there's a note here, and it would be Unmúlatush Dachtalachta 3 of Lynn. Would you just go into the 3rd years? So then I would get on my bicycle, and I would find out where he was and his and I would do a lecture on the history of economics. So that was kind of a thing. Now, UCG, when I was there as a student, 62 to 66, and it's interesting, Garrod O'Tuig and I both enrolled on the same day, and we have become friends to this day. You know, Garrod is someone I have great admiration for. He's a very fine scholar, but Ontario Eric Magan, and this is a kind of a very conservative position of mine, perhaps, but he kept a magazine going right to the very end, and he used his dots and stroked the Shiva and I actually, for a very long time, didn't change myself.
You used the dots and used the Shiva the old
Yes,
life.
I did, yeah.
I
actually liked it.
Yeah.
And I found somehow or another, it's very interesting, I found these H's, putting in these H's, Stron Sherlock. I was one of the last to change. What I do feel incredibly sad about is in relationship to people who think that it is fashionable to be able to say that, it was used for a very long time about it, if one's children weren't doing well at school, to say, she did wonderful if it wasn't for the Irish and things like that, which of course was nonsense, because there are people speaking several languages, and there's an interesting division among younger civil servants. There is an affection and an interest in the Irish language, but where there is in fact actually a great disappointment is at the highest level. And that bothers me. It bothers me because I remember when I was trying to make the case, and I successfully, I hope, for television in the Irish language. Curiously, the public, their political representatives, were very positive, and so forth. But there were some senior civil servants who had the view that it was a white elephant, and therefore and actually went to extraordinary degrees to block what I was doing in relation to what was capital expenditure and what was current expenditure. And what I find extraordinary is that why would the people who have the greatest advantages, both in terms of salary and everything, why would why is it that they are not giving an example? The other thing about it is it's not an answer to say we have an Irish stream, rather like we have the Irish-speaking servants and we have the English-speaking servants. I remember in Galway in the 1960s, I was enthusiastic about deepening the language. I remember the tragedy of the language, of saying to an older woman, saying to me, she was referred to as Teangan Bád and Teangan Bóchtarish, whatever, the language of poverty and the language of immigration. That to me was important because I have wanted always to get close to the language as a felt experience.
What does that mean, a felt experience? What is it? How does one engage with the language in a felt experience?
Well, you see, this is the thing. When one is experiencing a life, a great deal of it is there are preliminary silences. It isn't really the creation of reason or rationality. It is out of instinct. And this gets complicated because it is repressive systems seek to put boundaries on sensation, feeling, and also it's one of the sources of deep conservatism. I put no truth in it, really. The decision to proscribe the Irish language by colonial powers was just such an outrageous imposition on a people. And then there's kind of the whole business of if you spoke Irish at school, that there was a notch put on the stick and all of these. And the thing is, and I think in relation to post-colonial, post-colonizing realities, I agree very much with the earlier work of Memi, who spoke about how, in fact, people can adapt to this, and they allow, if you like, the residue of the colonizing instinct into their thinking and into their psyche. And I think that's one of the problems in Ireland. It is very, very difficult. You cannot recover the full freedom that you had. So therefore you make yourself remember there was something very respectable about English. And they would say, even when I was in Connemara in those early days, the person they really admired, Tom Cockyoung, he had the two languages, And you could see the need for it because people were emigrating. Agus Fisher Chastel, you need it, in fact. And for example, when later on, when I would be talking about the period of Patrick McGill and Donegal, what would happen there is they would have someone who had the English, who would kind of be the person who would represent them all. So they were effectively labour brokers. And one of the things as president was I invented the Machnamh series, and I began here dealing with the issue of the War of Independence, but then afterwards the Civil War and whatever. But one of the most difficult times was the times that I wrote an article for The Guardian, I remember, on imperialism and Timpercus. But in the period immediately after the establishment of the independence of the state in the 1920s, respectability was the main aim, and part of the respectability was in fact actually admiring those who were making progress in the English language. The result then, the response wasn't that, well, we're just going to impose Irish and just see will it work, and it of course didn't work. I think in one of my poems I describe about all the civil servants changing their names into Irish and in that. But I believe that in the 1920s, 1924 is maybe the most important year. And this would have interest in you, the kind of work you do. And it is in 1923-4, there was a commission on what were we going to do with the land. And what happened was very interesting because there was a minority report by Tom Johnston and Mr. Buckley, I remember, and they were the minority. But there were 1.3 million acres yet to be divided around the big houses, the domains. And the issue was, what would you do with it? Now, Tom Johnson and Buckley, they proposed that you have horticulture and that you produce for the local market, and there would be work in it for the agricultural labourers. And the majority report said, it's too late. We can't stop the cattlemen. And it's at that stage that, if you like, the land gave way to cattle rather than people. Right. And you've got a huge neglected piece of history, is the agricultural labourers who all emigrate, mostly to England, in that period. You also get something else, which is very interesting to me, and that is that I don't know how to work it out philosophically, but remember there are people who got land and who wanted a lot more, and there are people who got no land. So what was to happen then? Certainly, let us say people, best to use an example in the case of my own family. My father was split in the treaty. My father was released from the Curragh in December 1923. He was against the treaty. My uncles were in fact in favour of the treaty. But one of my uncles, the one who would have reared me, would in fact actually be managing a farm. But my father would have spent 1924 unemployed because the people who were released from the Curragh weren't given any, they certainly weren't going to get land. In fact, the other way around. If they returned home, their names would be given in as potential land agitators. So Ireland in this period then, who are we speaking of when we're speaking of reviving the language? So many people are gone. So you're talking about another layer of survivors, you see. After the Gortamord, after the famine, you have survivors of the famine. And then you have survivors of the people again. So with one person inheriting the land, one dowry and so on, you know, the old, rather superficial study of Arnsberg and Campbell suggested the others must travel.
That's right.
So what is happening in the middle of all of this, too, is very much, from a post-colonising point of view, is the importance of respectability. The church runs it the same way. It will, in fact, actually draw a distinction between the strong farmer who can give the biggest donation to the collection and the poor person who would give a half a crown. Yeah. And so so where is Irish radicalism?
Because you have that unraired lahan, the sort of Weltanschauung, this wider view, you've seen in cultures all over the world where sometimes a culture, a language, a mythology, all these things rises up in spite of everything, in spite of the intellect, in spite of culture, in spite of economic things. It seems to have its own flame. Is that too romantic to say?
We weren't the only country where language was suppressed. You look at the experience of Africa and the beauty of some of the way that people move and speak and so forth in these what would be regarded as smaller languages. And the interesting thing about it is, among Africans themselves, there wasn't this instinct to suppress another language in order to be able to know your own language. That is, in fact, the achievement of the colonizer.
So from a global perspective then, what role do we have in Ireland? Like, we're people, as you say, who were oppressed, who had a lot of the old mythology, the language, the lore wiped out, but still we have so much surviving. So is there a responsibility on us then to maybe bring some of this back into ourselves and then to do this almost missionary zeal, or where is our role in that?
Well, you know, I have a mixed view about this. I think talking about our successes and so forth, I think the reluctance to trade in our vulnerabilities is maybe something that and that concerns me very, very much. It is a post-colonizing experience to be throwing shapes. When you have people saying, for example, we're a poor little country, but we're a great country, much of that kind of of guff is fine, but the point of the matter is, in many things, is a great, we don't draw sufficiently on our shared colonizing experience. That the language has survived is wonderful, and that should be used as an encouragement to other people who are in fact trying to protect their indigenous reality. For example, the most likely threat at the moment is probably in the Arctic, where in fact people might start mining again in North America and so forth. And there are groups there that we should really give support to, it raises the issue about the relationship to both land and the relationship to the way of life and the relationship, which is very important. I think that it's great pity in a way that we don't see the strength of that. In relation to Marxism, for example, I could never accept the full thesis of materialism, insofar as that I agreed with the concept that cultures reproduce themselves through exploitation that is not limited, in fact, to the economic, but to domination and repression and so forth. I don't think we put the work in. It's very interesting is that, yes, we've been speaking now about how the language can be spoken about more, but there are things that can't be spoken about as easily as when I was younger. It was much easier during the course of my lifetime to speak about peace, to speak about criticism of capitalism than it is now. As philosophically, I would put the question to about it. I'd like to see the evidence of where capitalism can in fact be reformed, amended. In many cases, you might say, if you look at the social welfare systems of the world, they're usually described as social protection. They have to be won from something. You look exactly at the same thing in relation to the public space. Occasionally, and there were brilliant examples of it, including where we are in the Phoenix Park, that are in fact the result of the use of surplus. Remember, it was a park, hunting and things like that. Mind you, you did have the gate so that the ordinary people couldn't come in and ruin it for everyone. But the fact of the matter is that the public world has regularly, in fact, actually been to be saved. There are three things that I think are hugely important. One is the notion of modernity. What is regarded is that the post-industrial revolution of 1760, may say 1830 or whatever, has released something that is the only model for change. So therefore, with it, you get industrial rather than agriculture, you get urban rather than rural, and so forth. And the idea is that forward-thinking people, there's always been an intellectual apparatus, so therefore you don't teach anything but what is needed to keep this onward, forward movement going, and so forth. And even you can have people saying about that it needs stability. It has de facto, for example, as somebody has said, that 40% of the planet is now burned and so forth. It might have all of these things, but these don't matter, you see, you move. And in that case, I just so admire the people who take a stand to keep bits of the fabric, of the tapestry of the life that is the planet alive and so forth. And I think one of the things that which would be challenging and very much into the years to come would be to pursue all of what I have said in terms of a shared humanity. Now, the interesting thing in relation to that, to me, is that I avoided until the very late using a concept called species failure. And if you take as I said, the planet, and if you take the loss of biodiversity, you take the imposition of the tyranny of speculative money across the planet, and so it's very hard to say is this not a species failure in terms that it was only by being in conflict with nature that the humans could make progress, as they call it. They're interesting connected concepts as well. It begins with I was mentioned modernity. Before modernity, you had progress. And before that, in Bartadole, is that you had the famous statement that I've often quoted in my speeches, I lead to you nature and her children and bondage for your use. Getting past that, and this is where I have to be very careful about it all. I don't want to be over pessimistic in relation to the commodification of the world at the present, in many cases. If you want the end point of the collapse of civilization, it probably is in the suggestion of two of the richest people in the world fighting each other in a cage. There probably is, to my mind, that is a species indicator. That is among the lowest levels to which the human species can sink. So when you think about that, then, in many cases, that there are people who want to look at this kind of thing, it is how distanced they are from anything that has the semblance of truth or experience in it. You know. But the idea that this is, in fact, actually an epochal success, and that is an issue. I have to be, I'm speaking to you as Michael D. Higgins, I assure you, and that's why I don't restrain my views on some of these matters. I think that what has been unleashed in the world, it is a good question as to whether we're recoverable. That's why I try to find aspects of hope myself. I believe myself that the alternatives to that lesser kind of living are likely to come, I think, from the continents of Africa and South America rather than they are from the so-called developed countries. Elements are in fact connecting us. And the elements actually under threat in many cases are shared, which is of course the point of view is that there's no such thing as actions in one part of the world that don't have an effect on the others. When I think why my particular interest in food security in Africa, I think 14% of the population of the planet are in Africa. I think it will be about 40% of the people under 21 within a decade or something like that. Why can't they, in fact, actually do things entirely differently? And I have been talking to them, which is interesting, and it'll be encouraging to know. There is support for what I'm suggesting in terms of production of food and food sufficiency, in terms of meeting sufficiency before you address the issues of surplus and so forth. And therefore, you get a civilization of simplicity as well. That those views are welcome in Africa, but they're not necessarily welcome in Europe, or those who would speak about the defining the world in terms of the largest market. You know, this is just, and I accept that. I accept one of the things about it is that my views, it has been difficult to offer them, and I understand very well those for whom they're not welcome.
And you know that in 20 or 30 years' time, you're going to be looked back on as this prophet that was saying things that we're only getting. It's without doubt, without doubt.
Well, you know, if you get an idea of it, in fact, actually, in my book, when I was writing for Hot in the 80s, I saw some of this stuff coming, you know, but that is why the ability to be in each other's lives with responsibility and kindness and shared vulnerability is what it is all about. And that isn't utopian, that is capable of being achieved, and it can be achieved, yeah.
Is there an argument to say, though, that English and the modern languages have become so infused with an exploitative, a capitalist, a materialistic mindset that actually when one goes back to any old language, one can have a wider idea? Like, I think of you made the first Minister for the Arts, you know, that word in Irish, ara, it means so much more than minister. Ara, a caretaker.
I have to say to you, Magan, that is something that struck me. is about some of the words in Irish, like, for example, creativity is, in English, that's cruthíocht. But all of these words, íocht, and saoíocht, which imagination, and whatever, if I were to look for hope now, it would be in these areas. And the Irish language, for example, among the new young generation that are speaking about it, they're actually in a time of no repression. The interesting side of it is that they're able to take the complex new stuff that's happening around them, and they're able to see it through the prism of the Irish language. For example, it is of such significance that you could have a film made, Aracht was the one I'm thinking of, or Colin Kuhn, and that it could go internationally, go around the world, and people will see this is happening in a language that was in fact once forbidden, proscribed, and that in fact was saved. Now, if you think about it in more detail then, you see that they actually have expressed imagination and saoíocht in their day and so on. But there's also, of course, the future, and that is that in the case of somebody would say that in the history of cultures, defining culture, the problem had always been is that physically we are finite and imaginatively we are infinite. But the point is, as you're imagining things as well in relation to that, it isn't required to make a binary choice between the past and the future. And that actually is that is very positive. The same thing is true in movements of the body, I think, in relation to it. It's very interesting to me how, when I was minister in many cases, dance was the area that I thought needed a particular assistance. Now, how did it happen that people regarded, in several different cultures, the body as a source of sinfulness? This kind of, if you like, Jansenist thing that came into Ireland. I provoke the historians for not really dealing with this one. And I always remember that when I was a member as a young senator, and I had just co-signed the alleged peace legislation on the abolition of the status of illegitimacy. And a senator said what Senator Higgins is proposing and speaking about is socialism onto the sheets. And the idea is that if you had to choose between the integrity of the land and the integrity of the person, you let the person go. Now, how in many ways that can be regarded as a spiritual position, it wasn't, of course, at all. What it was dogma, and it was an abuse. And certainly it could never be able to accommodate a full respect for the woman's body. Where all of this was in many, many cases is every now and again, if you're talking about Shanachas, the point about it is, where did this come from? And it wasn't inherent, really, in relation to the Irish language as it was spoken and experienced and so on. The other, I think, which was, it has always moved me very, very much, is the relationship of touch to soils, for example. I had, somebody gave me a bowl full of soil when I became president, and he said to me, would you just put your hand into the soil every day now? And I have it actually upstairs here. But the thing about it is, when I look back on the relationship to animals, and for example, the kindnesses that were interspecies that are there, like for example, the people who knew the names of cows, and they knew the characteristics of cows. And then the other thing, I think, as well, the so-called abuse that was a form of modernism. For example, insisting that the travelling people should get rid of their animals. I think that was such an outrageous outrageous cultural imposition. No more than, for example, the notion of they travelling in accordance with seasonal things and different things, that they should be in fact in the one spot. Transience is the natural condition. And therefore that is why, in fact, why, for example, do countries, why are they not able to understand migration? Because they assume that it is the natural condition to be in the one spot, the sedentary. But it isn't. The fact is that all of the movements of different species and so forth, including the human species, has been always of movement and adaptation to new conditions and so forth. And the interesting thing is that where the morality of it came in was being able to do so in pursuit, yes, of security, but doing so out of respect for where one found oneself in new conditions. You asked me a question earlier about poetry. I believe that when I look at the different poets, including from Patrick Kavanagh to Neruda or whatever, it is in poetry that you get a distillation of the possibilities that have not yet been recognized or that have not been achieved. And I think as well, in the case of the loneliness and the disappointment and anxiety and depression too, is in my own poems. And those poems that I wrote in the second collection, for example, at the same time there's an attempt to get past it. For example, my poem, The Death of Mary Doyle, in the second collection. And I see that in Kavanagh. Kavanagh is uneven because the point about it is that there's a very strong spiritual connection, very like what you're arguing, I think, in relation to, in the case of Kavanagh. I think the studies on Kavanagh show that he saw a spirituality that was connected to the land, to the soil, but even more so to the practices. See, there's a difference between, if you like, the fields and who owns the fields. No more than today, for example, there's a huge difference between being a farmer and being a person owning land. Some people who said it's part of my portfolio. That's not a farmer. But more importantly, the knowledge and the wisdom that comes from the interaction of the different cosmic forces and so on.
In one way, there's a huge amount on your shoulders, and almost a tragedy, because you were a poet. You were between two worlds. You saw all of this, that we were coming, that our current society was corrupt or rotten in so many ways, or just non-functional. That we came from a time where we were embodied. We came from a time where we were engaged with the animals, with the land, with the citizens.
Well, I actually challenge that, you say.
Go on.
I don't believe that there was a golden age at all. I think that we never worked it out. This is where I think the challenge of engaged philosophy and others was. And I have a problem for myself in relation to the disconsolate view that people notice. For example, I believe that it's very interesting that I believe my admiration for Patrick Kavanagh as a poet is because I understand that Kavanagh is very interesting for what I have just said. Kavanagh is an unsuccessful migrant. In his own words, he made it too late to move to the city, so he couldn't accommodate the city except in its fringe activity. And then he keeps many cases, he keeps about that ground and that forth that he keeps thinking about. But there's no guarantee he would have been there either. Because the point about it is, in many cases, I don't think the proximity to the land itself, or even ownership of the land, confers any advantage. It is in fact in how you use it. I am, I suppose, a supporter of the utopian tradition, if you're trying to locate me in relation to writings. And why about that is that I believe that the appropriate arrangements have yet to be achieved. And that's what's exciting about young people. It's exciting in many different ways, is what has yet to be born. Now, you might say is that rationality was compromised in the 17th, 18th century, very particularly post-19th century, on the idea that the reasonable thing for people to be doing is to be looking for more. But I've just said to you, look at the paragons of looking for more. Two of the richest people in the world want to beat each other up in a cage because they think that they're going to be able to condemn people to watch them. Now, that raises the thing then where we had at the very beginning. If you say that the nature of life is in fact what one will find is a struggle for significance. People are looking for to kind of, sometimes they find it disconsolate to do it in silences. And yet the most sophisticated relationships are ones that are actually without language. But if you look at that, think about that then, about the relationship between sound and the rational. And I think the long sigh of a person who has lost someone. I think, for example, I get so angry as when I see the people holding a child in Gaza in their hands, and somebody saying, I've lost all of these. And that agony is something that is shared in the world as a kind of a human sound. And beyond that sound, then, in many cases, there is an ability to be able to deal with the other, and you can make your way into the complexity of the other's language and music and so forth. There is a thing, for example, I remember writing a poem about this. A person going home late night always encountered a particular stone, and the impulse was to kneel at the stone in many cases. And what was doing is that one were conferring a significance on it. And I think that it is about not having distances between feeling both of the material and the immaterial. But then in addition to that as well, the Saoi, where they said many, it isn't only that people touched the material, it is in fact that they thought about it. And imagination is beyond experience. So therefore, there is such a thing as a collective, sets of experiences, and they are all there as a kind of mosaic. But what I think you're really touching on in many cases is that when the influence from outside comes, that is where, in fact, the idea of linearity is an abstraction. And the idea of modernity is an abstraction built on an abstraction, and it is highly contentious and ideologically laden and culturally exclusive and so forth. So therefore, in many cases, is that every now and again people find, they would say, somebody is being themselves, as if they've broken away.
What's fascinating most about you, Uachtarán, is because you are a fila, because you were a poet, and the poet in Ireland traced their lineage back almost to Druidic times, to Bardic times. So they had that magical ability of breaking people's minds open. But then you knew how to use the law. You were also in government. You were able to come at it from both sides in a way. To practically try and change our mindset, but also with these poems to try and break open the mind, to widen.
Well, it was a privilege to be given the opportunities that I got, and those who arranged and supported me and all of that. I'm so grateful. But there is a price that was paid to in relation to. But then again, I keep on saying many people always imagine that if I wasn't doing all of this, I would be free to do this. But then, if you were free to do this, the kind of thing, you don't know what you would have been as equally to some. No, the important thing is to stay curious and to stay hopeful. I find my hope is that the horror of where we are now in relation to being unable to live together in conditions of peace, being unable to speak about peace, this endless notion of war. And for example, the suggestion that security is in fact something that must always be protected by a capacity for violence. This security of which most peoples in the world want, security from hunger, security from threats of different kinds, and all of that is possible. But the language of war is just something rather like of the same status as the two men in the cage wanting to fight each other to show. That is species failure, and one has to have the courage to see it like that.
So aren't there are almost two different things happening at the moment? As you said, there's a lot of darkness rising up, a lot of combat, a lot of sort of almost this male fighting for dominance.
Yes.
And then there seems to be something rising too, this connection, particularly among young people,
Yes.
of wanting more holistic view.
Absolutely.
And that maybe the language and the lore can help.
I think that it's about the recovery of the importance of friendship. Is a great part of it. For example, this evolved actually rather than happened suddenly, because it's very interesting about the nature of the family and so on. When I was teaching and doing some research on migration, one of the big changes in Ireland was when the people would refer less to parents and family, but to friends. And I think that the friendships are now enormously important. I must say, even since I became president, if I attend the funeral of a young person, I was extraordinarily moved. And by the way they spoke about the person that they had lost. And what's very moving about it, I think, was too, is the way they would describe it as the person has a presence when they needed it. And of course that means about it is the great loneliness that is there as a real problem in Irish society. And in that sense, I do agree with you that it is hopeful and positive, Jarafat, that really that it is an alternative. I think you may well have one way well ask the question is that if you say, I say that a youngster has died and his friends are talking about, her friends are talking about, they're able to describe it in a kind of an accountable way. But what is totally unaccountable are those, for example, who have corporate power who simply don't accept any responsibility. So what the young people are doing is that they're taking responsibility for each other. That is the communication of the world in a universal sense.
So what should we do with that? What should the people in their 20s and 30s that I see on my Instagram or whatever feeling this connection and not knowing how to make sense of it, suddenly feeling that they're lacking this rootedness and feeling it in, I hate to say just Irish language, because it's more than that. It's the lore, it's the music, it's what should they do? What should we do?
They should embrace as much as they can of difference, and with kindness and curiosity, and without judgment, and let it happen to them. What's very interesting is in relation to the way that performance works like that. People say, every serious performer will say, and just once it starts, there's something else happening. That is of what you're speaking about. That is, in fact, that's why there is such value, in fact, in pursuing, in fact, the essential features of humanity as a species in relationship to other species and biodiversity. And that is something that is very possible. That's what would be a genuine new beginning. Yeah, it's worth support.
And the artists, I think, and creatives do have a role in that, don't they?
Yes, absolutely, because you see, you're saying you're not limited to boundaries, and you're not. That is which has been imagined. I wrote a poem after a conversation with John O'Donoghue of possibility. The interesting thing about it is that towards the end of life, in the later parts of life, one thinks very much about one of possibilities. And possibilities are wider than even what was imagined. Because imagine is limited to the visual in many cases. But they're like a residue in everyone's life, all of the possibilities. So therefore they deserve respect. And there's nothing wrong with the fact that they haven't been achieved.
Yeah. It's lóchran tú, you're a lantern, mobile wecha Uachtarán.
Hánsig módlam, curmír mát.